Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Sims. I am the undergraduate and student success librarian here at LSU. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today on this panel that we are so excited to be hosting. This has been made possible through the ALA Resilient Communities Grant. And having said that, I will hand it over to Haley.
Hi, everyone. My name is Haley Johnson. I'm the head of government documents here at LSU Libraries. And the format of the panel today is I'm going to go ahead and introduce each panelist, and they will give us 5 minutes of a summation of their research, kind of introduce us to what they do. And then we'll go through all the panelists, and then we'll turn it over to our moderator, Becky Carmichael, who will ask questions. Throughout, if you have a question that pops into your head, please place it in the chat, and we'll have time for questions and answers from the audience at the end. So I'll go ahead and get started, and we'll just go alphabetically. So our first panelist is Dr. Rebeca de Jesús Crespo. She's an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Sciences at Louisiana State University. She holds a Ph.D. in Integrative Conservation and Ecology from the University of Georgia and MS and BS degrees in Biology from the University of Puerto Rico. Awards from the Ford Foundation and the Fulbright program helped fund her graduate research. Dr. de Jesús Crespo previously worked as an ecologist for the Environmental Protection Agency's National Health and Environmental Research Laboratory, where she earned the Gulf Ecology Division Scientist of the Year Award and the EPA Environmental Justice Award. Her research links landscape level patterns of anthropogenic activities, ecosystem services, and socioeconomic factors to indicators of ecological integrity and human health. Dr. de Jesús, take it away.
So much for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here today. And so I am very used to using PowerPoint as a way to talk through my research. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and hopefully it will work. Let me know if you can see my slides. Let's see if I can you see them? Okay, great. So I would like to start my introduction by just telling you a little bit about where I come from and how I got to studying the things that I study, and then tell you just brief snippets of the research that I've been doing in the past 5 years. So I am originally from Puerto Rico. And when I was growing up on the island, it was the 90s, there was a lot of development going on, urbanization of the island with new residential developments, strip malls, and the like. And I experienced the transformation of a lot of my favorite natural places to visit as a child. And that really just motivated me to dedicate my career to trying to understand how we as humans can meet our needs without destroying the environment that provides so much to us and that is essential for our lives. And so when I went to graduate school, I found a good outlet for this interest of mine in the study of watersheds. And that's the picture I'm showing here. It's a good illustration of like a watershed where you have those mountains. These are agricultural mountains that are draining into a valley. That valley has an urban development, and it's all gonna end up flowing into a river that flows through that town. And by studying a river, you can really study the impacts of our activities in a very focused location. And it's a really good place to kind of just summarize all of the damage that we could do to the environment at the landscape scale. So I've studied the linkages between urbanization and agriculture to changes in aquatic ecosystems. And when I was conducting studies in aquatic ecosystems, I was focusing on studying like the biota and things like oxygen and sediment, which are very important for the functioning of ecosystems. But because I was working in human-dominated places, I often got asked by people that live nearby and saw me sampling these creatures, like, what are you doing? And when I said what I was doing, they always asked me questions like, can I drink this water? Can I bathe here? Can I eat this fish? I mean, can my children come play? And so I realized that if I wanted to make a connection with our activities and how we're transforming the environment, I really have to make more of a connection with how it affects our livelihoods, our human health, and our well-being. And so in the last 5 years or so, my research has transitioned into studying impacts to human health and well-being from our landscape transformations and environmental degradations. So some projects that I've done with these topics include the following. In the city of San Juan, I studied the relationship between wetlands and vector-borne diseases. And I found that places with more mangrove and wetland cover were less likely to get a dengue case during an epidemic period. And one of the reasons why is because wetlands promote habitat for mosquitoes, but they're not the mosquitoes that transmit disease. And other factors are they help reduce temperature, and that is not good for the mosquitoes that transmit disease. And so this disproportionately benefits low-income people that live in houses and neighborhoods like the one showing this picture that really are exposed to hazards like mosquito-borne diseases. Also in Puerto Rico, I studied the connections between extreme weather events and exposure to gastrointestinal infection, and found that 1 week after an extreme rainfall event, we see spikes in gastrointestinal infection among the elderly population on the island, okay? And lastly, here in Baton Rouge, I recently completed a study in which I compared a high income and a low income community in terms of the abundance of mosquito vectors for diseases. And I found that there was a high proportion of the Asian tiger mosquito, which is a vector for dengue and Zika, diseases that we don't have in the state, but that could be introduced in the future. And it was related to an excessive, a disproportionate abundance of abandoned homes and empty lots that attract waste disposal practices, particularly used tires that serve as habitat for mosquito vectors. And so those are the latest projects that I've been working on, and I'll leave it there. And I'm so happy to be here today and share with you some of my thoughts about environmental justice and climate change.
Thank you so much. Okay, up next we have Paul Miller. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences here at LSU. He is a coastal meteorologist whose research examines disorganized convection in the Southeast US and the Caribbean. After arriving at LSU in 2019, he founded and now supervises the Coastal Meteorology or COMET Lab, which houses 5 to 10 undergraduate and graduate student researchers. The COMET Lab's current projects encompass a range of applications, including drought in the US and the Caribbean, pop-up thunderstorm forecasting in the Southeast US, urban effects on weekly forced thunderstorm activity, and modified weather patterns during COVID-19 lockdowns. These projects are supported by agencies such as UCAR, NSF, NOAA, and NASA. In addition to his research activities, Paul's classroom instruction, including a climate modeling experiment based on the Disney movie Frozen, have been featured by the Associated Press, US News and World Report, and a number of other outlets nationwide. Prior to LSU, Paul received both a BS in meteorology and MS in geography from Virginia Tech and a PhD in geography from the University of Georgia. Paul?
Thanks, Haley. So I had sent Haley my bio yesterday, and then when I joined this meeting, realized it was supposed to be 5 sentences. So I apologize to Haley for for that mouthful, but that is a great introduction to what I'm going to show you here. So I'm a coastal meteorologist in the Department of Oceanography and Coastal Sciences here at LSU, a relatively recent addition to the university, starting here in 2019. And so kind of my research in a nutshell, kind of to put a theme maybe on some of those things that Haley just mentioned, kind of looks at this idea of how does what happens on the Earth's surface affect what happens above the Earth's surface? So we know things like land cover, some of the landscape transformations that Rebecca was describing, that not only do those have an effect on kind of local scale, community level, health and economic and social changes, but they can also affect local weather and even maybe larger scale climate patterns as well. And so really, for each of the activities that I'll show in some additional slides, you can probably link them back to this kind of core question. So I kind of look at this across a range of scales, and I just have a short slide with a graphic kind of showing how this plays out in my research. But the land surface can affect the atmosphere just through changes in terrain. So in Louisiana, we have a big ocean right next to us. So we have ocean and land in close proximity to each other. That's a huge regulator of the weather patterns that we experience here in Louisiana. Things like mountain ranges we found can really regulate thunderstorm activity, especially afternoon pop-up thunderstorms. Also, transatlantic dust transport. If you're familiar with the Godzilla dust cloud from 2020, it's a great example of how that can impact communities very far removed from the Sahara Desert. Also, defoliation from hurricanes is something that I'll speak to briefly, as well as human-driven changes at the surface. So one of these, if you look out here, this is just a map of the density or the occurrence of afternoon thunderstorms in the Southeast U.S. And it doesn't you don't have to be a scientist to pick out the Appalachian Mountains right here. How we have these kind of immediately increased values along the coastline. So these are kind of examples of how our lab looks at the terrain-related changes in land cover and a land use type, how that can affect thunderstorm activity in the Southeast. Also, I mentioned Saharan dust emissions. This is an example from 2020, our Godzilla dust cloud that captured the headlines for a few days. And you can just see on visible satellite, it's seen from space where we have this cloud of dust transiting the Caribbean for a few days. And the research we're looking into is not necessarily what happens to the dust, but how does the dust affect the atmosphere? And so these dark gray and black values basically indicate 0 chance of precipitation. So if you have this dust moving across your region, don't expect it to rain. And we've been able to connect these back to particularly a very devastating drought in Puerto Rico during 2015. Additionally, changes in abrupt land cover. So a hurricane moves across a coastal area. It removes a lot of foliage all at once. And we have reason to believe that that would affect the way that energy is released from the Earth's surface to the extent that it could actually modify weather patterns. We published a paper in 2019 actually looking at how weather patterns were modified for about 6 weeks following Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. So this wasn't related to the hurricane. The hurricane had moved on. It was gone. But just the way that the hurricane had altered the landscape of the island was manifesting in weather changes weeks later. You can see here, just we go from green to brown landscape, lots of clouds to fewer clouds. And it seems that kind of this day shown in the satellite image is a bit of a microcosm of what happened for a few months or for a few weeks. And then lastly, this was mentioned in my bio, but recently we've been looking at how changes in industrial activity during COVID-19 quarantines actually affected weather patterns as well. And actually, we just published a paper that shows that during the COVID-19 lockdown in East China, the temperatures actually increased over a certain area here. You can see the reduction in emissions seen by satellite before and during the quarantines. And that actually manifested in about a 0.2 degrees Celsius warming over that area, just by kind of cleaning the air out and allowing more sunlight to reach the surface. So anyway, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our next panelist, and thank you for the opportunity to serve on the panel today.
Okay, next we have Kevin Smiley. He is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at LSU. His research studies social inequalities in urban environments, often focusing on disasters, race, immigration, health, and social capital. He is the author of the book, Market Cities, People Cities. Kevin is currently a fellow of the National Science Foundation's Enabling Program for the Next Generation of Disasters and Hazards Researchers, and was also awarded an early career research fellowship through the National Academy's Gulf Research Program. Kevin?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Let me go ahead and share my screen a little bit. Can everyone see that A-okay? Excellent, thank you. First of all, thank you for having me on this panel, and congrats on winning the grant. It's very exciting. So I am assistant professor in sociology, as was mentioned, and I've been at LSU since last summer. So I'm new here. So I'm excited to meet some of you all. I think of my research as primarily in 3 different areas, all of which interrelate. The first area is I study disparities in health risks from industrial air pollution using an environmental justice perspective. So often this research focuses on differences from neighborhood to neighborhood, examining what sort of neighborhood characteristics tend to be associated with more industrial air pollution. my research adds a complementary layer. What are the characteristics of metropolitan areas that tend to have more industrial air pollution? One of the sort of implications is that there's a few dozen metropolitan areas in the United States that tend to host a disproportionate amount of the industrial air pollution in the United States. And so the average neighborhood in those places often can be even more polluted than some of the most disadvantaged neighborhoods in other places. So that has implications for some of the places of which we live, the Baton Rouges, New Orleans of the world, for instance. A second line of research that I conduct is part of a larger mixed methodological, qualitative and quantitative cross-national comparative of analysis of two cities. And those two cities are Copenhagen, Denmark, and Houston, Texas. So we sought to do a comparative analysis, and in the end, it was actually just full of complete contrasts. And so we elucidated out some core concepts that help us to understand those contrasts. So we sort of identify Houston as this market city and Copenhagen as a people city, and then think about how that fundamental cultural orientation infuses itself in local institutions, government, and what the implications are for a wide range of social outcomes, including often relating to the environment and particularly to climate change planning. A third area of work where I've been moving more recently has been to think about climate justice and disasters. And so working from a perspective that analyzes the social vulnerability to disasters, I've been involved in both national analyses of how disasters can sometimes expand inequalities in their wake, as well as locally relevant research, primarily on Hurricane Harvey in Greater Houston, examining disparities in flooding across neighborhoods in that city. One way in which I'm sort of thinking about these issues at present are thinking about how our existing modes of social stratification, our existing patterns of social inequalities end up having implications for inequalities in terms of who experiences flooding. And one of the ways in which I try to think about this are how does environmental phenomena end up intertwined with social phenomena? And so this sort of proceeds directly from my thinking, both as a sociologist, but also as an environmental sociologist. And so, for instance, I'm studying how increasing social inequalities play a role in landscape change, namely through the rise of impervious surfaces that come with urban redevelopment and new subdivisions, and how that impervious surfaces has implications for potentially rising flooding, because we no longer have those local landscapes to soak up the water as natural sponges as we might once have had. I'm also studying how social inequality has an impact on human-induced climate change. And so I have a working paper now on actually pulling out from Hurricane Harvey the climate change attributed portion of the storm and seeing who experienced flooding from that portion of the storm that would not have happened had it not been for anthropogenic climate change. And one of the sort of findings is that it appears to be racially unequal across space. Sort of a final thing I'm moving more into is to studying infrastructural change and thinking about how our mitigation infrastructure can help ameliorate some of these issues too. So within each of these are both increasing social inequalities, but also the keys to unlocking insights into ameliorating them, thinking about preserving our natural environments, lessening our impacts on climate change, and making more equitable and better infrastructure. So I look forward to talking with you more from here.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, our next panelist is Clint Willson. He is the Mike N. Dooley PE Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering and the Director of the LSU Center for River Studies. Clint graduated from Penn State with a BS degree in aerospace engineering and then served in the U.S. Marine Corps for 6.5 years. After his service, he went to the University of Texas, where he earned an MS in environmental engineering and a Ph.D. in civil engineering. He has been at LSU for almost 23 years, teaching and doing research in the broad areas of water resources and environmental engineering. Clint has supervised or co-supervised over 40 MS and PhD students. Clint?
You're muted, Clint.
There we go.
shared before I unmuted.
There we go. Now we hear you.
Yeah. You can tell the old guy on the panel, right? How's that? Okay. No, first off, thank you all so much for inviting me to do this and to interact and get to share a little bit about what we're doing, but I think more importantly to think about how I think the four of us and multiple others across campus really can work together, both educating our students and in research. So again, thank you for the invitation. And I guess really I'm going to start with, for the past 20 years or so, I've been thinking about the Mississippi River, thinking about, our coast. And, coming from, initially I'm going to say I came at this, primarily from, an engineering infrastructure. What do we need to do in terms of flows and sediment transport, et cetera? But thinking about, our coast in terms of until we really started making major changes and alterations to the river and our coast, we had a pretty healthy, vibrant ecosystem, right? And you can see that kind of with this depiction that was the rendering here by the Coastal Sustainability Studio. And then really thinking about, and slowly my not just the research, but my way of thinking and approach to, education and research also got to, okay, so how are we really transforming these kind of dynamic ecosystem, in this case, the mighty Mississippi and its historic meanders and the natural dynamics of that process to very much what you see on the right there, a nice engineering, here's the way we're going to, quote, control the river, right? So, hopefully you kind of get to see a little bit about, not just my way of thinking, but how it's kind of led to the work that I'm really focused and excited about. Then we kind of think about those anthropogenic, changes that were induced through, economically driven, as well as risk reduction to communities. But all that disconnect of the wetlands from the river has led to, a major land loss over the past 80 to 100 years. And, the Coastal Protection Restoration looks at, what's going to happen in the next 50 years. And so, a lot of you have probably seen the red map, right? And, but thinking about that and, but what really has over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, starting to think a lot more about the communities, about the residents, about the, the inequalities in terms of our decisions in terms of planning and the dedication of resources and the infrastructure that we're thinking about and the way we're thinking about planning, what's happening, but then also like dialing it back sometimes and saying, okay, well, we often think about planning and design in terms of what we expect for the future, what we want for the future. And, what I've really gotten to think more about is, okay, wait, that is important, but there's a lot of things we need to do to kind of level the playing field. At least that's my, let's say, or as I think Kevin, Rebecca, and Paul really have all mentioned somewhat, we've got to go back and fix things. Okay. It's not just about making sure we're thinking about the future. It's going back and saying, okay, what do we need to do to fix a lot of these inequalities and inequities? And so, I would say that, some of this is, kind of what should the lower river and communities look like in 50 to 100 years. And again, it's not just thinking about, okay, what do we want it to look like, but how do we kind of reverse or at least try to mitigate or encompass, communities that have not really been thought about or that don't bring necessarily that high economic value to something. We need to be thinking about how do we in this cost benefit analysis, those benefits, right, are more than just a dollar value. Okay. Then the other thing, and it's a little bit of a story here a little bit, and I think part of this is driven by work with the Coastal Sustainability Studio. It's also a lot of involvement with the LSU Honors College and getting to do a number of book clubs and co-teaching some classes. And so over the last 3 or 4, probably 4 years or so now, had an opportunity to interact with and discuss, a number of books, as a water guy, they're all related to the environment and water, but had the opportunity to kind of not just expand, let's say my viewpoint or the way I look at these issues, but really also to get our students to think about that. And so really have had a great opportunity to have students who aren't just coastal environmental science or engineering, but sociology, or they're international studies, they're economists. And I think that's really helped me, kind of think more about, not just the research we're doing, but even when I'm just teaching fluid mechanics, how do I kind of bring some of that into the world? And then the last thing I want to talk about, and I think it touches on really some things that Kevin and Rebecca and Paul talked about. In the upper left-hand corner there, this is some work we've done with our Inland from the Coast National Academy of Sciences Gulf Research Program project with the Coastal Sustainability Studio and a number of others. In the upper left-hand corner, you see kind of changes in land use, land cover from 38 to 92, okay? And then I didn't show this, the current land use, land cover, but if you would ask me 5 or 10 years ago, okay, what does that mean? It would have been very much in changes impervious, right? But now what I think we need to be thinking about is, okay, well, what's underlying, what's the health and well-being? What are some of the other factors that are underlying those changes in land use, land cover? And I think everybody here has kind of touched on that a little bit. And so what we're doing from in our group is not just looking at, we did look at, okay, how do the changes in land use, land cover impact water surface elevations or flood inundation depths throughout the Amite River Basin? And that's what you kind of see here on the right, are some changes just due to the land use, land cover. But what I would say is the differences really are mostly less than a foot due to the changes in land use, land cover. So what we're really thinking about here now is it's not, the land use, land cover, or even the changes in the river's, geometries or its ability to move stormwater or, flood waters, but it's really about how do we live with water, okay? And because, again, it's this idea of, okay, how are we planning for the future? But at the same time, going back and overlaying those land use, land covers with health and well-being indices, different metrics, so that we're looking at, okay, we're not just thinking about planning for the future, but we're thinking about what projects, what kind of benefits do we have, can we put into, these planning and design processes or procedures. So with that, I'm going to stop. I think that was my last slide. So I hope that made a little bit of sense and maybe tied us all together a little bit. So happy to answer questions and participate. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thanks so much, Clint. Now we'd like to go ahead and introduce our moderator for the panel. Becky Carmichael is the disturbance ecologist in the College of Science and College of Coast and Environment Communication across the curriculum, or CXC, science coordinator here at LSU. She focuses on science communication development and pedagogy, supporting science faculty in designing communication-based content for over 200 courses. She is an instructor for the College of Science and Ogden's Honor College and serves on the College of Science SCI 1001 Curriculum Committee. She currently collaborates with colleagues at San Jose State University and Scott Community College for a tri-institutional course called Global Views on Environmental Issues, engaging students on issues of their shared environment. And we'd like to turn it over to you, Becky.
Thank you all. I'm very excited for us to share kind of your perspectives and hear a little bit more about how your research is touching in on the environmental justice ideas and issues. And so to start, I would like to ask this first question, and we can proceed again how you were introduced, if that's okay. So we'll start with Rebecca. So our first question is, what do you each see to be the most pressing climate change consequence here in the state of Louisiana?
So I think that Louisiana is going to experience a multitude of effects from climate change, and some of which we're already experiencing with the coastal land loss and erosion that's going to probably be exacerbated with sea level rise. Another important one, which was talked about by Clint, is flooding. We're going to experience more flooding, more droughts. And in the long run, those impacts that are going to be felt first are expected to have impacts on livelihoods and economic activities in a variety of ways, such as whether the species that are of economic importance to our state, the fisheries, the agriculture, crops that we focus on, whether they're going to be able to adapt to those changes that are expected. And so those are the types of things that I think we need to be paying attention to.
Paul, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I think I'm going to steal a sentence from Clint from his introduction, but Clint mentioned this idea of that it's not necessarily how much did the water change, but it's kind of more learning how to deal with the water, learning how to live with the water. I think when we looked at the climate change impacts in Louisiana, it's not that necessarily all of a sudden we're going to have to worry about a new impact that we've never thought of before, but it's kind of it's sort of the same ones. It's flooding, it's hurricanes. Those are still happening. The question is, might we be getting a little extra rain when those events happen? Over the course of a 10-year period, are there a few extra hurricanes, or maybe an extra category 4, category 3 than historically? So it's not necessarily, in Louisiana, we're used to dealing with hurricanes. It's still those same hazards, but it's maybe learning to adapt to them in a different a different intensity level, or a different kind of magnitude of impact than maybe we've been used to historically. And then in addition, Rebecca mentioned this, but certainly sea level rise as well. And so I think that's something that probably we'll end up circling back to several times throughout this panel. But that's something that Louisiana is kind of uniquely dealing with compared to other areas of the U.S.
Absolutely. Kevin, what are your take on those consequences that Louisiana is facing?
My first thought is I'd be hard pressed to pick even just one, because I think they're all so important. So at risk of just stopping there, I'll sort of think about the intersections between different things. And so, you sort of loss of wetlands and land subsidence is itself related to heavy industrial activity, which has implications for environmental justice too. Extreme weather events can be powered a little bit by land cover that's comparably impervious. So that can worsen, the size of a hurricane and things like that. So one of the things I'm sort of following and interested in longer term is how these things are just going to intersect more and more in an era of climate change, and thinking about what some people are starting to call NATEC disasters, or natural technological disasters. So the ways in which some of our technological systems may interact with natural systems. And so that could mean many, many different sorts of things. It could be thinking about, going back to Hurricane Katrina and thinking about failures of levees. It could be industrial accidents that are caused by extreme weather events. But one of the things I'm sort of interested to follow is these intersections of all of these important issues, because they just sort of then raise the importance of each individual issue all the more.
It's certainly something that we can't discuss in isolation, and kind of with all of the 4 of your presentations, especially, you've highlighted that nicely, is that none of these events are occurring as a singular kind of component that's in a vacuum, but they're all kind of interacting with each other and having those larger effects. So Clint, I'll turn to you. What do you see is that pressing piece?
Yeah, so one of the driving questions behind this, the Inland from the Coast project was, how do people that are, this, let's say, inland migration, or at least this, people maybe being flooded several times, or realizing the risk they suffered where they lived, thinking about, okay, I'm going to move somewhere where it's going to be safer, but it's still close to my job, or it's relatively close. And I think it's starting, thinking about, or maybe better educating, better informing people about what kind of the true risks are. Because I think several people have already mentioned, with sea level rise, with these perhaps, more intense, events that may happen, I think areas that we didn't necessarily think were at such a risk, will be in those 10 years or 25 years. And I think from an engineering standpoint, and we really try to highlight this with the students, is, they get frustrated with how poorly the stormwater system works now. And I'm like, well, okay, you're the next group, right? So, make sure that they're, your kids or your grandkids or whatever, right, are not saying the same thing about what you did. So, that's at least the way my 2 cents for now. How's that?
I appreciate this because too, yes, I really appreciated the line of from your presentation about we have to really address what's not worked in the past for us to move forward. And I do agree, identifying those pieces that need to be addressed so that in the next 10 years or 25 years, when we have yet another intensity or something else that's occurring, we're better prepared for it. And this, I guess, one of the other things I wanted to ground us in was our ideas as they evolve around environmental justice. And so again, I'd like to kind of come through each one of you and ask, for your definition of environmental justice and whether or not you see any or have heard any issues with the verbiage around that definition. Is there any problematic phrasing that is used in tandem with environmental justice?
So just a general definition of environmental justice, we want to make sure that everybody has equal access to the benefits that are derived from our environment, and at the same time that not specific groups are not disproportionately affected by environmental hazards. Aside from that, I've heard a definition that includes broadening the participation of groups that will be affected. And I think that that aspect of it is often just placed kind of like, just like routinely without really paying attention to what are some of the strategies that we increase participation? How are we distributing the information? Is that accessible in terms of language and the technologies that we use? Are they widely available to the people that would need to see them? Are we putting meetings and times that are adequate for people that work? Those types of things are often not considered enough. And so participation, I think, is one neglected aspect of those definitions.
Paul, what are how do you define environmental justice?
Yeah, well, I think I think Rebecca gave a good definition of environmental justice. I think one of the when I think about the complexities of it, one thing that I often kind of think of in these situations is that actually I'm kind of guilty of this in my introduction slide, but I kind of show this one-way arrow from the land pointing up towards the sky, and really it's a two-way arrow. And so what I'm getting at with there is that sometimes when we look at who's affected by what weather hazards and trying to see how the impacts fall disproportionately, one of the things is that the weather hazards themselves are changing, and the way that we're expanding and where we're building new things can also then change the hazards themselves. And so I think it's something that when we look at these patterns historically, to me, I always kind of wonder if we're missing something about how they might occur in the future. And so certainly that's a question, kind of looking forward to kind of understand how we might expect some of these things to change, but while also kind of realizing that what we're doing at the surface and by building things in certain places that might actually then kind of change the hazard itself. And so there's kind of this kind of two-way feedback that I think can be very hard to accurately identify. And especially then I think that gets magnified when we look at it through an environmental justice lens, because who lives in the place that's affected is very kind of at the foundation of that question.
And Kevin, as I turn it to you to get your thoughts on definition of environmental justice, I particularly was interested in hearing from you whether in your research, did you see any kind of problems in how we typically define it, and any suggestions for modifications for going forward?
It's a great question, and it's something important to think about. So sort of just base foundation, one way in which I sort of teach about it, I guess, is I often think of it in two parts. And so one part is identifying inequalities and environmental exposures that are unequal socially in some way. And so the birth of the environmental justice movement was often around race, about how particularly Black communities were located near landfills. And so now we've expanded considerably from sort of one type of environmental exposure, namely waste, to all kinds of different environmental exposures relating to disasters and all manner of different things, and as well as different axes of social differentiation that might matter. You can have environmental justice issues that can map on to things well beyond race too. And so that's sort of the one part, is identifying the inequalities. But I think one of the things I always try to raise too is that it's also social movements that are working to upend these inequalities. So sometimes if I, as a, an academic researcher, the term environmental justice isn't really driven by the research world, really, although it's certainly used and frequently, but it's something that's always sort of being regenerated by social movements, by activists, community organizations, by government at multiple levels. And so the sort of social movements working to upend those inequalities is an important part of it. And it's interesting for me as a sociologist to think about the social movement size, because a lot of my field has become focused on identifying inequalities. And one of the things that I think environmental justice gives us is this really focus on social change that's really inherent to any discussion of environmental justice just at the beginning. So in terms of any problematic definitions and things, I would agree it can mean many things to many people. And so, I'm hesitant to even come in and say that it absolutely should mean this sort of thing. I just sort of have some broad concepts to help orient myself. But certainly you're going to get different definitions. There is a US government Office of Environmental Justice within the EPA. They have their own definition, but you could interview, a few dozen environmental justice activists and they could give you a totally different answer. So it's interesting to think about how that differentiation is actually, I think, generative for thinking about what environmental justice is.
Thank you. And I agree. I think that I'm glad that you brought up the EPA division that focuses on environmental justice. I know in terms of classes, working with students, that has been rich in order to kind of talk to them through about these concepts, particularly talking to them about histories and when this was brought to the forefront of kind of our knowledge and really for public awareness, those moments that were pivotal. Clint, same question. What are your thoughts on the definition?
Yeah, I'm not going to go with the definition. Let me say that at least one of the things that, and I'm going to say this, irritates me or bothers me is the conflating of the economic activity or benefits of, let's say, an industry, right? But it's that conflating of the economic benefits with the really true inequality of the people that are impacted by that industry or living in a certain area, et cetera, right? I'm not sure if this is making sense or not, but I think you often hear people talk about, well, but that industry brings X number of millions of dollars to the parish or the community or whatever. And you're like, okay, yes, it does, but you're missing the point that they're trying to make about this particular community or these neighborhoods and how they are, just disproportionately impacted by the presence of that or poor planning or whatever it is, if it's hazards or whatever other aspect. So I'm not answering your question. I apologize for that, but at least that's one of the things that I have get irritated about. Let's say when you hear these kind of arguments, not arguments, but people talking about it's not as bad as you think.
So can I want to clarify a little bit, because these are some questions then. Are you saying, take for example, the Cancer Alley that is between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, you've got multiple different industries. Was it 85? I can't remember the exact number, but you've got several different industries that are quote unquote bringing economic value, or they're supplying jobs. In this case, would you say that we don't take into account the complete cost of having those industries?
I think, yes, I think that's one of them. That's correct. I think that, the economic benefit is not necessarily or as proportionally valuable perhaps to the communities in the neighborhoods. I don't know, I'm sure Kevin, Rebecca, the rest can speak to this more clearly probably, or tell me if I'm way off base. But I do think there is, or even, a plant, getting a permit to increase their emissions or to add another, and it's always the number of jobs they're going to be created or, whatever. And you're like, but you're still missing the point, I think, of taking care of, and taking care may be the wrong word, but truly valuing the neighborhoods and the communities in the vicinity. Does that help a little?
That does. And I'd open it up to our other panelists. Any other thoughts or expansions that we should highlight on this?
I got one just small point to make is that there was a really interesting study that at least confirmed one of Clint's key points here. And that's, it was done by some economists in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which, one of the half a dozen best journals on the face of the planet. And they actually were able to get access to facility data on who's employed at that facility. That idea being that, yes, these facilities may be more likely, heavy polluting facilities may be more likely to be in communities of color, but hey, we're giving jobs to those local communities. And they were sort of able to tease out there was a mismatch between the racial composition of the workers at facilities compared to the local communities surrounding that, namely that the local communities tended to be have a greater percentage of people of color than the workforce in those facilities. So that's sort of the trade-off argument that you often hear that Clint is sort of critiquing is itself partly not even true, which is interesting. That doesn't necessarily empirically bear itself out.
Paul, Rebecca, did you have any other thoughts to add to this?
I don't, but I would mention that underneath it all, a lot of these environmental justice problems are really just highlighting factors associated to income inequality. And so often poor communities have to prioritize things like getting a job or finding an affordable home, and then things like being exposed to an environmental hazard that may cause cancer or not over a period of 15 years gets put on the back burner. And so I think it's a good point to try to break that myth of there's a trade-off because you're gonna get a job, and just also acknowledge that underneath it all, this is a conversation about income inequality and access to those basic needs.
Thank you for that. I'm in complete agreement. And Kevin, I think that PNAS article, if you have at some point that citation, I definitely want to read that as well. So since we're talking about those inequalities, in particular groups that are facing these issues, we had another question that is relating to some of the communities that are really local here in Louisiana. And so there are many emerging climate impacts on health of Louisiana communities. So residents of Cancer Alley, as we were just speaking about, climate change refugees such as the Lejeune Charles, extreme weather, vector-borne disease illnesses, as Rebecca, you had spoken about earlier, just to name a few of those. So how are we preparing for these climate impacts? And how can students and the community become more involved?
I think that I would turn to all of these initiatives that have been, I'm new to the state, and so I don't know how long these initiatives have been in place, but I'm very impressed by initiatives like the Louisiana Watershed Initiative, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority programs, the Coastal Sustainability Studio. And to the extent that we can design projects in collaborations with institutions such as those, I think that's a way that we can contribute greatly with our skills and our knowledge, because it would help us design user-driven research. That is research that is not only trying to answer basic science questions, but developing solutions in real time to some of these problems that we're facing. And so I think students, researchers at the university level could take more advantage of those collaborative opportunities.
Yeah, real quick, if I can jump in just real quick, let me, and I realize that Rebecca brought up a point and made me think about this, is that, post Katrina, the CPRA with the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority was formed, and they were then told to develop this coastal master plan. And also post Katrina, there was a planning effort called, I think it was Louisiana Speaks. And the idea was kind of initially those were two individual efforts, but with the long-term vision that eventually you're going to have this kind of combined science and engineering and regional state planning efforts that were going to come together. Well, there is not a state planning agency, right? There's no kind of state planning authority. And so that planning effort really just kind of fell off. And then you saw CPRA continue their work with the master plan, and their mandate is, for better or for worse, their mandate is a science and engineering plan for risk reduction and for restoration. It isn't planning. And so I think one of the things the Watershed Initiative, Rebecca, thank you for bringing that up, is that it's kind of bringing back that, right, those efforts. And I think there are other entities, that have really pushed for, okay, we need to be combining this planning, right? This community, user, people-driven, efforts, along with then the solid science and engineering, I say solid, plans, right? That then you can have both this kind of, I say, economic and kind of people-driven, analyses that can move us forward. Again, I didn't mean to jump in. Sorry about that, but I just wanted to, maybe kind of lay that out, because I think that does get a little bit to the point, Becky, of that question, right? A little bit is kind of how are we preparing? And I think the state has a chief resiliency officer now. Just within the past year, Charles Sutcliffe was appointed to that position, and really to bring those agencies together, is the different state agencies is a really nice step forward, thinking about climate change and how that impacts the state and the services.
No, and Clint, don't apologize. I'm glad that you jumped in with that, because I think part of this whole kind of us coming together is for those ideas as we have them to come out. And I do think that there's some power too about involving I don't want to use the phrase stakeholder. I'd rather, I think, use the community members, and whether those are community members that are lifelong and they have generational history in that space, or if that's someone who is more of a student from the students kind of space, where they're coming in and they're here for a while, but they're still community members that have value. And I think that anytime we can have individuals here involved in that research, involved in those actions, not only can it help move initiatives, but then it also increases more investment in those causes. So if our students stay in Louisiana, excellent. If they go to somewhere else, they can maybe pick up and they're more aware of those kinds of issues that could occur in other locations. Paul and Kevin, did you have any thoughts on this question about community involvement and how we prepare?
Yeah, I do. One, and I think kind of under my interpretation of the question, this kind of relates to community involvement. But I think one of the things I've noticed just in the 2.5 years I've been at LSU, but is how there is so much local experience from students on this campus dealing with these issues that we're talking about. And I think that it's so easy sometimes that you have this textbook from an international publisher, and they have a picture of a surge barrier in the Netherlands or something, and they give you a nice picture and some slides to go with it. But it's like, no, we have one of those at Lake Bourne, and a lot of our students from New Orleans have seen it and have driven past it and talk about that. And I think that that's a huge resource that a student maybe from Shreveport or Monroe or somewhere else in the state, that instead of sometimes us using these more generic out of the box examples to illustrate these kind of global climate change concepts, that there's a huge, I hesitate to say untapped, because I actually think LSU does a pretty good job of facilitating this. I think classes in the Ogden Honors College are a great example of that. But I think kind of that push to maybe solicit some of those like lived experiences from students that are here that can say, I remember Hurricane Katrina. The water came all the way up to, to halfway up the refrigerator in my house. And that was the first time it ever happened. But then it happened a few years later, not even with a hurricane. It was kind of weird. It's like when they talk about those things, I think that it lends a lot more credibility and gravity to the types of discussions that we would try to lead as academics.
That's a fantastic point. And I that also leads me to think, when I think about, students in our classroom, that they're not only students, but we're all collective learners. And so I find that because those members of the class have those differing experiences from different parts of the state or the country, what they can contribute to concepts that we are trying to convey in our places, and how that leverages a lot of the conversations we can have. Kevin, did you have anything that you would like to add to the community involvement for our students on preparing for climate?
Just one small thing, which is sort of affirming what everyone else said and even taking it a step forward, which is that because we have so much local knowledge, both in terms of like research expertise at LSU, just, the capacities and understandings of people's local knowledges about how they move through their own communities. One of the things I think about sometimes with Louisiana is that our problems are so particular to, our issues are so particular to Louisiana, this wetlands loss, these extreme weather events, these things like this. And at the same time, sea level rise is going to be something that's going to be affecting the world over. Extreme weather events are going to be affecting the world over. And so in a way, the ways in which our students, community members outside of LSU are handling and dealing with and coping and adapting right now are providing the sort of playbook for the sort of things that people will be doing decades down the road. So, maybe my grandchildren in middle age will live in Boston, Massachusetts, but they'll be facing a not totally dissimilar environment from the one I'm facing now. Because at least in terms of, from an abstraction level, the types of threats. We have an opportunity to sort of uncover what people are doing right now to understand these issues and sort of lead in that way.
Excellent point. Making sure we're all aware that, it's not always just something local where your feet are at the moment, but what's happening globally and what are the implications. We have had a question from one of our audience members, Joe Harmer, and he's asked, he says, I've heard a lot about saltwater intrusion in the aquifer underlying Baton Rouge that we use for drinking water. If depleted, we would likely switch to river water of a lower quality and at a higher cost. The improper execution of this strategy led to a horrible situation in Flint. What solutions exist to this problem? What do you think about the current status of the government regulation of industry and water policy at the local and state level?
I'll start. How's that? Since I actually was hired at LSU as a groundwater person. How's that? So, first off, we could have an entire afternoon workshop or seminar on the water policy, governance or lack of governance, and let's say, and the issues around, let's say, just at least the Baton Rouge or Southern Hills aquifer systems. But I do think there is, you're not going to get a major change in what's happening without a change in the governance. And again, somebody else here may be able to speak to that more clearly. But industry, public supply, personal use are all kind of weighted the same at this point in terms of governance and the ability to extract water. So, without a change in that, or at least some ability to what's the word I'm looking for here? Either to induce or to encourage users, like industrial users, to change to, using Mississippi River water, which is done in along the river in multiple places. It just, it's an economic cost that needs to be either compensated or accounted for in some way. I don't know if that makes sense or not. I think that, there's definitely a lot more awareness of that. And I think more and more, people are getting vocal about it and understanding that, yes, groundwater doesn't move that fast. Okay. So it's not something that like a flood where you'll get flooded in a week, or a day after the rain. It takes years for this to happen. But, I think, there's enough cases and enough visibility, I think, where people are understanding that this is an issue that needs to be looked at. I will say that, the Flint, Michigan, and again, this is speaking a little bit out of my expertise, but the Flint, Michigan, the horrible conditions and the situation there was really a result of switching the source of groundwater or switching the source of the drinking water that then led to a different chemistry in the pipes, right? That then basically mobilized some contaminants. And so, again, something that I think is much higher on regulatory agencies' minds is if you do switch a source, right, then that could be an impact. I think at the end of the day, our drinking water is going to continue to be from the aquifer. It would not be switching the city of Baton Rouge or, Baton Rouge water to getting Mississippi River water. I think it's more about how do you get industry to start using that water. I hope that wasn't too long of an answer or too convoluted, but, and I hope if I didn't answer that person's question, they can happy to email me and I can chat about that.
Any other thoughts or ideas related to Joe's question?
Yeah, I'll just add something. It kind of Clint's response, I think, kind of brought this up. But there's a time scale issue that's involved here that kind of makes these solutions challenging. I think Clint used this word that groundwater doesn't move very fast. And so there's kind of this idea that it's something we can maybe figure out later and that there's always kind of more time. And I think that is a thread. The reason why I kind of mentioned this because that's a thread that kind of runs through all the things that we're talking about. It's kind of this idea that, well, we can figure it out tomorrow. And when I talk with the students in the classes I teach, I kind of say, hey, who's worried about climate change today? And no one raises their hand. They're worried about their test that afternoon or some social function that they have coming up later. And so it's just kind of this this idea that we can always figure it out later. There's always more time until all of a sudden there's not. And so anyway, I think that kind of underlies a lot of the solutions and challenges that we're talking here. So Clint mentioned that. I thought it was something worth.
That's a great point, Cole. That's a great point. And you know what, Becky, real quick, that would actually go to, and I'm going to jump ahead for a second because I know we're running out of time. You said kind of final thoughts to share or major action item. I think kind of what Paul said is something that we all could probably do more of, right? Is help people understand that a lot of, whether it's learning to live with water, whether it's learning to, think more about communities or neighborhoods or thinking about, climate impacts, take action now, learn about that now, think about how you can, in students' case, how can you apply your major or your interests or your expertise or your passion, right? Think about that now so that you can have that impact, whether it's, more of an impact in 3 or 5 years and maybe see the impact you have.
So I wanted to ask panelists, do you have time for one more question? Yes. Okay. So we have another audience member, Becca. She says that she's a graduate student in the social work program here at LSU, and she's developing a thesis project focused on environmental social work and our role in advocating for environmental justice and enacting more comprehensive climate policy for Louisiana residents. She liked Rebecca's mention of user-driven research and would like to know how the panel speakers would implement user-driven research when addressing climate change policy.
That's a great question. And I think for me, what I've tried to do whenever I do research is to always develop it in partnership with either a specific community that I think is disproportionately being affected by an impact. In the case of Puerto Rico, we developed that project on dengue with a community that was in a situation exposed to flooding, exposed to poor infrastructure, and have a lot of waste management problems. And their community leaders helped us develop the study, collect the data. And so through that, we were able to establish a connection with them and understand better their other problems and their other research needs. And so that way, the next project that I did, which was, this one about gastrointestinal infections, was really informed by those types of interactions. And so developing projects, not in isolation in your lab, but also just trying to get out there and find a partner that's doing management. Sometimes we want to do something that's very lofty goals and contribute to science and have a breakthrough. But a lot of times managers have very simple needs that we could contribute with research projects that are 2 or 5 years long, like a graduate student would do. And so trying to find those partners, I think here in Baton Rouge, there are a lot of NGOs and organizations that can serve that function. And I would be happy to talk with the student later on if she's interested in helping her figure out some potential partnerships or ways to identify those needs. Maybe not necessarily if establishing formal partnerships, but just looking through the documents that they have put out. There's a lot of management project reports and plans that really can inform research projects.
Thank you. So kind of as we've come to the close, thank you all for staying the minutes extra over time. I wanted to thank you all. This has been a great conversation. I see this as being an hours, honestly, because there's so much to really unpack and get into, and we really just skimmed the surface. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Haley and Sarah, and also thank you all so much for letting me take part and learn more from colleagues here at LSU.
Of course, thank you so much, Becky, for agreeing to moderate. And thank you to Rebecca, Paul, Kevin, and Clint for agreeing to participate on our panel today. We are so thankful that you all were able to make the time to share your research and your expertise with us. I just want to remind everyone that the recording of today's event will be made available to all attendees and sent out to them. And it will also be posted to the LSU Library's YouTube page. So we just want to thank everyone again, and we hope that this is the first of maybe many more of these types of panels to come. So thank you so much for agreeing to participate. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.